Hello, I'm Joseph.
I'm Merrick.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about the national question in Marxism and the debate about the transition to socialism and the debate about stage theory, skipping over capitalism, the debates that were being held in the Comintern. And
Specifically in the context of anti-imperialism and
exactly,
anti-colonialism.
yeah, exactly. And so we'll focus it on the prospect of revolution and socialist revolution in the global south in particular. So, just to begin, I think that a lot of people who read Capital, first of all, will perhaps read it in an inappropriate manner with respect to like generalizing Marx's view of the like historical development of England in particular into a model for the rest of the world has to follow it that way. I've heard this from a lot of people who talk about, in particular like have this Western focus and say Western countries went through this path of development. You go through feudalism, then capitalism, and then socialism in this kind of stage approach. And they necessarily generalize that to countries in the global south and say, in order to prosper, go to socialism, you have to progress through capitalism like every other country in the world did. What's interesting to me about that is that Marx himself wrote in a letter to a Russian newspaper a little bit after Capital was published, basically telling them like it's a mistake to take my analysis of the development of capitalism in England and sketch it this like historical genesis of capital in England that he sketches and apply that to every single different country. And so he's actually very presciently rebuking them for trying to say Russia has to go through capitalism just like England did. What's interesting about that, and this is something that thinkers like Walter Rodney draw out really well, is to say that countries in the global south actually, in many cases, can't follow that exact same progression because, as we know, primitive accumulation that was able to accumulate capital for a country like England was necessarily derived from the process of colonialism. So to say that a country like China, for example, and this is something that thinkers like Minchi Lee have written about, can possibly redo colonialism, which is something that some on the left and some liberals actually do accuse China of, which is demonstrably false because it's simply historically impossible. Minchi Lee does a good job of showing that colonialism conducted in the present era would probably destroy the planet if it was happening. But instead, what's true is that China is in a semi-peripheral state and itself is still having value extracted to the West. But that's obviously another conversation. It's more to just show that, like, for thinkers like Rodney, who wrote, he has an excellent collection of lectures on the Russian Revolution and the view of it from the third world, where he says that, you know, in his perspective, looking at Tanzania, which was his example that he was discussing socialism in at the time, there was a lot in comparison with Russia in 1917 and Tanzania in the 1970s in respect to like their feudal conditions, the overall class content of peasants as the majority, and the fact that capitalism as like England had experienced it was not achievable in Tanzania, hadn't occurred. And so for him, thinking about socialism in Tanzania was necessarily going to be a different historical path than England. What's interesting with this, and we wanted to do this to talk about some of Lenin's writings on the national and colonial question, and in particular his view as he discusses in the Third International in the Congress of the Comintern, I believe the second or the third. They're doing a debate at one point about the national colonial theses that Lenin drafted, and he asks the question, or is asked the question, of whether his theses, which he wrote, and basically in them he suggests that like the proletariat of colonial countries should ally with a national bourgeois class, which is advocating for democracy or independence of the colonies in most cases, is their primary goal. And he says that with that respect, the immediate priority is the independence of the colonies rather than sort of trying to create socialism while still being colonized by a European power. But what's really fascinating is Lenin has this part where he's asked whether he believes that colonized countries should also have to go through a capitalist stage. And he says we reply in the negative to this question and insist that if the proletariat of these countries can use propaganda, the support of the Soviet governments, they can achieve socialism without having to repeat the tragedies of colonialism and capital accumulation like what was done in England. Of course, this debate comes up also in the Soviet Union, which itself was kind of in a feudal condition during its revolution. And that's why I think there's like Evgeny Preobrazhensky talk about primitive social accumulation, primitive socialist accumulation, and the debate about how to do capital accumulation, which is necessary for the country under socialism, without the need for colonialism, for example. And Stalin would kind of talk about this with respect to the collectivization process. He has a speech where his speech to the captains of industry, where he says basically the Soviet Union will have to do what England did in 200 years, in 5 years, and that's pretty much because of the view that the Soviet Union will have to industrialize and develop rapidly, of course, in the immediate term to face off war, but also in the long run to actually meet the challenge posed by the Western capitalist countries in general. And the only way it can do that is some form of primitive socialist accumulation rather than capital accumulation through colonialism. And of course, that's kind of a still an up in the air question of what that looks like. Is it collectivization forcefully? Is it a democratic one? But what's interesting, I think we can perhaps talk a little bit about with respect to China.
Well, that's so interesting because I was about to say, I mean, talking about Lenin, Mao had a very interesting relationship with Lenin. You know, he would go back and forth on his support. I think he has like a quote that's like that Mao has a quote about Stalin that's like Stalin did 70% of things right and 30% of things wrong. And you know, the translation people kind of go back and forth on, but it's like a certain percentage. Mao, you know, was known for kind of, you know, trying to use percentages to, you know, quantify and, you know, understand situations. But they, in the early stages of the Communist Party in China and their relationship with the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, for their liberation movement, their revolution, you know, there was a lot of questions. I mean, for one thing, the Chinese Communist Party was essentially a product of the of the Soviet Union and of the Comintern. You know, there were I forget his name, but there were special representatives from the Comintern who went to China to develop a communist party based on already existing communist thinkers and you know, more people who are on the side of liberation or who are inspired by Lenin's revolution. But they would go back because of this relationship. There was a lot of debate on the power of the Soviet Union versus the power of the Communist Party of China, the Chinese Communist Party. And they would talk about, you know, the relationship with the Kuomintang, and the Soviet Union was very adamant in saying that the Chinese Communist Party had to work with the Kuomintang. They were one of the most staunch supporters of this relationship, of this allyship. And in the end, I mean, eventually we would see in Chinese history that this relationship was not tenable. After the deaths of Sun Yat-sen and the rise of Chiang Kai-shek, it was clear that the right wing of the Kuomintang, which was a kind of a big tent party, which had a lot of different organizations that were part of it, was not a proper environment for liberation of China. And even there were even thinkers who would talk about kind of the need to it was interesting. You know, I was listening to the Mariátegui podcast where Mariátegui says the national bourgeoisie were, you know, incompetent. Like because they were, you know, imperialist dogs, because they were, you know, tools and susceptible to the ideas of
like parasites.
Parasites. They were European, you know, they were susceptible to the ideas of European bourgeoisie as well. They were incompetent to actually produce, you know, a productive society. And so some people would even go so far as to say, you know, like going through the national liberation without a socialist liberation first would, you know, push things back, you know, without a strong government, without a strong party system to, you know, run the country, this newly liberated country, you know, national bourgeoisie and another imperialist parasite type groups and classes would continue to underdevelop the country, and kind of goes back to your point on the periphery and things like that. I mean, it was another thing that they talked about in the Mariátegui podcast, where Mariátegui didn't have access to, the ideas of dependency theory and world systems theory. And, it's interesting that while Marx was what led to the development of dependency theory and world systems theory, it kind of goes back and reanalyzes what he talked about, and even what Lenin talked about, and what other communist thinkers, including Stalin, talked about, as we've understood more and more the relationship between newly independent countries and the imperial core.
Well, what's really fascinating about, in particular, the relationship of the Communist Party in China and the Kuomintang is that in the national and colonial theses that Lenin presented to the Comintern, he basically says, like, they have a whole debate at one point about whether to use the phrase bourgeois democratic or national democratic. Lenin originally wrote it as bourgeois democratic, and he kind of like accepted the criticism and changed it to national democratic at a certain point. And I remember he says that, like, we should be very clear that the proletariat should never go into an alliance with the bourgeois democratic front. And that's fascinating, because then, of course, Lenin died quite early, but it's so hard to know this like very fine line between when the national bourgeoisie of a colonized country is going to go from being purely in its own interest as a bourgeois democratic force and advancing the goals of capitalism in a colonized country, or fighting for independence, or actually being revolutionary. And you could maybe make the argument that in the situation of independence or anti-imperialist action, they can be revolutionary to fight against like the Western countries, or in China's case, fight against Japan. But when you go back to, or like an independent situation, then you no longer have that alliance. What's interesting in reading like Mao's take on the debate about whether you can skip over a stage, for example, is like he has the concept of new democracy, basically, where he says that an anti feudal or an anti imperialist revolution can be one and the same as a communist or socialist revolution. You don't have to do the stages, or like, because people read it in a very dogmatic way and say stage one, stage two, or even like the Trotskyist analysis of all this is to say, like, permanent revolution, you do one and then you do the other in rapid succession. Mao criticized Trotsky for that and said, basically, why even differentiate them? Instead, don't allow the bourgeoisie to ever get the upper hand in the revolution. And I wanted to bring that up to compare, something we've talked about, but to compare the history of revolution and the relationship of a communist party with a more national bourgeois group between China and South Africa. And in the case of South Africa, you read some of the documents, and like the South African Communist Party very heavily bought into the idea about like two stages of revolution. They coined the National Democratic Revolution, and have very much applied that to say the first stage of the revolution is against apartheid, and it has to come in the form of a national bourgeoisie one. The general secretary of the Communist Party, Joe Slovo, has a document where he talks about, the prospects of the working class in South Africa, and whether they can be in an alliance with, in particular, he's interested in the concept of like an alliance with the black bourgeoisie, for example. And he's very much in favor of it and says, at the moment, everybody's interests are the same. We're all like, interested in a revolution against apartheid. But he, at the same time, is like giving a lot of credit to the kind of neoliberal forces within the ANC and saying it's okay, as soon as apartheid ends, then we'll go and fight them, and we'll have enough power to contest them. And whereas in China, we've talked before, maybe the comparison's not perfect, but whereas in China, the Communist Party is able to defeat the Kuomintang after using them to a certain extent to fight the Japanese in that case, the ANC today is like very dominant over the South African Communist Party. It has very little power. And so it largely goes along with this kind of neoliberal, like pro-West, pro-IMF kind of like development. So you can see in one case how the theory can potentially work as long as you recognize when a national bourgeoisie is bourgeois democratic versus revolutionary, and in the other case you see a communist party that failed to do that. I wonder what you think about that compared
Well,
to China.
I was gonna say, I mean, I kind of want to get into Cuba
Oh
actually,
yeah, for sure.
but one thing I should say is that I think the most important thing to think about when we're considering like the historical context of revolution and the relationship between revolutionary forces and bourgeoisie forces is each condition is going to be unique.
Yeah.
And like thinking about Cuba, at first the Cuban Revolution wasn't an explicitly communist or Marxist. While Che Guevara had read Lenin, had experienced these things, the base of the movement wasn't interested in as much of the the political organization or as much in the political education. There was even a communist party in Cuba that existed before Castro attacked Bautista, before that revolution took place, and they criticized Castro. They criticized his methods. Of course, eventually they would, join forces in the new revolutionary government as Castro, declared Cuba a Marxist a state, a socialist state. But at first they would consider them, maybe adventurous or bourgeoisie, or that they didn't have political understanding. And I think something to talk about is that while bourgeoisie movements can easily be identified as bourgeoisie because we look at certain leaders and we look at the lack of political foundation, Marxist political foundation, the actual build and makeup of those different movements vary greatly based on the conditions of the country. So in the case of the Kuomintang, there were workers, who were part of the like left wing of the Kuomintang. There were also warlords who were part of the Kuomintang, which the Chinese Communist Party was staunchly against. There were so many different groups of people who were part of the Kuomintang that the Chinese Communist Party had to, think about its relationship with each of these different parts. In the case of Cuba, it was a little bit easier to analyze. While there were, like Castro did come from a more, not maybe bourgeois. I mean, his father was a landowner. Still, I mean, there were like Haitian people working on Castro's father's plantation and things like that. But still, I mean, yeah. But I mean, his goal was to, get, because of his experience with that system and his relationship with his family and things like that. I mean, he developed a revolution which would counteract those things, which were supported by the U.S. government, supported by Batista, who, of course, was supported by the U.S. government, in extension.
Right.
But I would just say that, the makeup of each of these different revolutionary movements, whether they're bourgeois or not, their anti-colonial message and their movement brings in a lot of different people, and also reminds me of what Mao says on finding true friends and true enemies. Identifying those two groups, it's more difficult than we make it out to be. Where if you just call someone bourgeoisie and you cast them aside, that might not be the most accurate representation of what's actually going on in the country.
Yeah. Well, one of the things to add on to this is like the extent to which Lenin's analysis, like to even think about a communist revolution in Cuba, South Africa, and China today makes a lot of sense, because these are the countries that have, to one degree or another, had a communist party in some degree of power. You can obviously contrast them. Mm-hmm. But what's fascinating to me is to think that 100 years ago in communist circles, or I guess a little bit more than 100 years ago, before the Russian Revolution, so 110 years ago, there was not a real like ability to theorize revolution in the global South. And in particular, Walter Rodney does a really good job of explaining this in his book, and he analyzes Kautsky and the other representatives of like the Second International. For example, he talks about how they read Marx and basically believed that, like very dogmatically critiqued Lenin and the Bolsheviks and said, you can't do revolution in Russia because Russia is still a backwards country. You need to have a capitalist revolution. First, they like supported the, the first revolution of like the the more kind of liberal anti-czarist faction, and then didn't support the Bolsheviks later because they said that Russia was not ripe for socialism in their reading of Marx. And what Rodney does a great job of showing is how this very rigid, dogmatic reading of Marxism that posits only revolution can occur in Western Europe first is very Eurocentric and denies the possibility of revolution in the global South, but primarily as well is like a very poor reading of Marx. And we mentioned at the jump the quote from Marx where he even Rodney uses that to say their critique is totally wrong because Marx himself did not want people to just say every country has to be like England, which we know is historically going to be impossible for every country to develop the way England has. So to even be able to think about revolution in these countries, we've had to have a thinker like Lenin, for example, be able to criticize the Second International. And what's fascinating to me to apply this today is to say that like this debate on the left has not really gone away from still a cursory reading of any debates on the left. Like we had a video, you know, just recently with Dr. Junju talking about the inheritance of Second International late imperialist thought, which denies that imperialism is a real problem, doesn't care about anti-imperialism, but there's still plenty of forces on the left that are not really invested and or still continue to make this claim that Marx says you have to do capitalism first and then do socialism, which you still hear a lot.
Well, I think one of the something that I've heard that makes me I think that debate has changed now, where a lot of people say if Europe doesn't have Europe has to be the first to revolt and then the rest of them can follow, right, saying that like the kind of the dominoes would fall if you have to start with the center of capital. And there's lots of people who will critique or they will kind of dismiss revolution in the global South because they think it's unproductive or won't do enough to change the situation, which I think is a very pessimistic, it comes from a very pessimistic view of Marx's reading of different theorists.
Or we even, just to interject, but like we even had a conversation recently about capitalist realism by Mark Fisher and how this is kind of a window into this like viewpoint. Mark Fisher is writing from like a British leftist perspective, and he is very overwhelmingly nihilistic. He's very pessimistic. He talks about kind of like the dejectedness of being unable to even imagine something after capitalism, but reading it and trying to read it from the perspective of like studying socialism in the global South, you feel very kind of like taken aback by it, because it's like people elsewhere in the world have not only theorized something after capitalism, but as Rodney shows in his critique, like they never were even able to think about capitalism in the first place in their country, because in a country like in Rodney's case in Tanzania, but any country in the global South, the level of Western capitalism, like in a place like England, was never possible. Those countries couldn't have capital accumulation through colonialism, and they were the colonized countries in that case. So
I mean, it's interesting because it makes me think again about Mariátegui, where it's like Mariátegui talks about the necessity of dream, or el mito, which is like this kind of idea of there's like a history of the indigenous peoples of Latin America. El mito is it could be applied to other indigenous groups, but specifically for like Andean groups, where it's like the conquest of the land and then the retake back against the colonizers in its continuing form. And I know that this idea is very popular. It's criticized by many, but it at the heart of it, it's about the idea that there has to be an alternative, that for the protection of the the cultural heritage of the heritage of indigenous people, you have to have revolution. You have to, like, there is no alternative but to fight and for revolution to take place.
Right.
And so when you see these kind of like pessimistic European thinking, which is like capitalism has destroyed our lives, but there's really no alternative, or socialism is such a far thought, I think that when we look to the global south, there's a lot more of the, dream, and there's a lot more of the like revolutionary fervor to emancipate oneself,
Right.
for the purpose of, you know, I think part of it is because it's easier to see divides between ethnic groups than it is between class.
Yeah.
You can see class, of course, class, you can definitely see the differences between classes, but when class and ethnicities, when those two issues merge, it is even more obvious.
Yeah.
Like anytime someone walks into a room, it can be obvious your different positions based on your ethnic and historical heritage.
Yeah. Well, something that strikes me as fascinating with that about still like it didn't really strike me until recently until we talked about it, upon first reading, because I think a lot of people's introduction to leftism nowadays comes through something rather cynical, like the Mark Fishers of the world, like this kind of approach that, you know, the most revolutionary thing you can even do is like suggest to someone that something different is possible. And I think that this is a very like lackluster analysis because, another thing that I related to often is to think about conversations that are, and you bring up the subject of like the necessity in particular for like indigenous people, colonized people of revolution, is to speak to the fact of generally like the awareness that people should have about the material relationship of imperialism and economic domination of the world to our kind of our day-to-day lives, and particularly people living in the global north. There's like the thinker Ulrich Brand wrote the book called Imperial Mode of Living, where he's making kind of a more environmentalist rather than like explicitly Marxist, but basically to say like people in the global north can enjoy kind of this like living standard and have become rather acclimated to it because of the super profits of exploitation and the super exploitation of people in the global south. And what I find relevant with that is just to briefly mention that like Lenin and Rodney in particular are two people who in their analysis, in Lenin's analysis, you can find it very consistently. He's talking about this idea of the labor aristocracy, which comes up rather often. And this is obviously a more complicated subject to get into, but he definitely believes to an extent that like the revolution in colonized countries, as he's talking about revolution in Russia being imperative, Lenin believes that people like Kautsky and Rodney says this too, like he calls Kautsky the spokesperson for the, more the like enlightened or elite European workers, and another way to say it, the labor aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting with that is and this is a very contentious topic on the left, obviously, and a lot of people don't agree to this, but basically to say that the mode of living that even the average worker or average proletariat in the global north is accustomed to is an imperial one predicated on extraction. And that's not something to necessarily say that nothing is imaginable in the global north, but it's more to say that exactly what you mentioned, that people who don't get to live the standard of life because they don't have material access or material domination over the world like Americans across the board do, will have to necessarily think of, not just think, but actually do something else, right? Like it's not even a matter of just like this capitalist realist kind of like you have to imagine something. It's not just like a dream. They actually put it into practice, I think.
It's interesting you say that, and I feel like that idea can even be expropriated to kind of the question of like using non-violent methods to promote revolution versus violent methods, or even like, I mean, it made me think about the changing relationship after Lenin's death with China and colonized, like between the USSR and colonized countries, where the Stalin era was more interested in working with these national bourgeoisie movements for liberation. In some ways they became pessimistic about the revolutionary dreaming and idealism. Maybe idealism is not the right word, but this kind of fervor for revolution that would break some of the traditional bounds that people said it has to go through a certain way so it can be the most effective. But I think that effectiveness is relative. And so even, as the USSR became more comfortable in its revolution, I know like Mike Gonzalez, when he was talking about Mariátegui, he said this, he talked about how they kind of lost that dreaming. They lost that ability to see revolution as, anything could be possible. And so people become, as their material conditions change, their idea of revolution changes, their idea of, how things should be conducted changes. There are people here because of their condition, in the United States, I mean, who believe that, elections are the only way to move forward because, they see the failures of, violent movements. And that comes back to that same idea of like your material conditions, because, it's so comfortable to just, vote, that doesn't do anything, it's so comfortable to do something like that compared to something that's so hard, like, wage, a violent revolution,
Yeah.
and the same thing where it's like easier to imagine a European revolution before a colonial revolution because that's only one block. But in the minds, of these European theorists, there's two blocks. There's colonialism and imperialism, and then there's capitalism.
Right.
But I think, thinkers like Mao, Mariátegui, Shea, they use the push of anti-imperialism to break right through capitalism.
Yeah.
There's no need. It's really finding the elements, the material conditions which are pushing towards anti-capitalism, and the first one is anti-imperialism. So if you can ride that wave to crash through both walls, I mean, and finding your true allies and targeting your true enemies, I mean, that is like the revolutionary idealism. And of course, it's not always as successful as we want it to be, but ultimately, I think it's more powerful than this kind of like meek idea of like, oh, we have to have this one, and we're gonna fight against people who think that we don't.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think, we can possibly talk about how all of this applies to the current world and like the purpose of wanting to read Lenin in the modern situations of the world. Like, it's difficult to evaluate whether the national and colonial theses in particular have real, like, I don't think anything can ever be really proven correct in this very rigid way as well, to say like, did we prove Lenin right about like his postulating about the world? But I think it's true to an extent that at the very least his theory that revolutions outside of Western Europe were going to start becoming more impactful in the world rather than those that he saw quite accurately that revolution in Western Europe was not going to be immediately possible. And what's fascinating to like then read a thinker like Trotsky by comparison, who keeps writing and saying that revolution will definitely come first in Western Europe. And he says that like in particular his view of colonized people, and he says like the revolutions in Persia or in Algeria will have to wait for those in France and England first in order for them to have some some like leeway in order to revolt. And I think that this was kind of this mindset ended up being one of the failures of ultimately a lot of the initiative in terms of having too Eurocentric of a view rather than viewing, as you just said, anti-imperialist action in the global south as contributing to necessarily. And I think instead, of course, like people have all on the alternative, and Lenin talks a lot about this and saying that if you are instead interested in shutting down the choke points of imperialism or of global capitalism, rather than trying to constantly like motivate the labor aristocracy, which to a large degree is very okay with imperialism and has bought into it in a lot of cases. That's not to say there aren't revolutionary groups in the global north, like in particular migrant labor that a lot of countries rely on across borders and everything, but it's more, or like oppressed national minorities, for example, as well. But to say that the labor aristocracy could possibly be a revolutionary force in the global north, kind of, I think to a large extent has been proven false. If you can say anything is false, I mean, that's kind of difficult to really like make such a judgment because history is still, of course, being made. But that's all to say that like generally, whether you want to make that conclusion or not, what's fascinating is to say, as you were just talking about, that whatever is happening in the global north, and the prospects look very limited to a large extent. What Lenin, I think, has been able to kind of bear out in the current day, and where he's most uh, like has the greatest amount of foresight in his writing, is to say that the critique of Kautsky and the Second International is completely wrong, to say that a country like Russia will have to go through a capitalist stage first, and Lenin's analysis to say that similarly, colonized countries don't have to go through the stage; they can actually reach socialism before they get too deeply encumbered into capitalism. And what's more relevant with that to say is, in the present situation, and as you were mentioning, for example, with like indigenous people and the concern about the environment as like a very existential threat to the existence of humanity and any prospects for socialism, capitalism and imperialism, the way they've developed, have necessarily required massive resource extraction, devastation of the planet, and to try and repeat that for every single country on the planet will mean the world is ending. So in that sense, it's not like you just have to do this like only environmentalist critique and say socialism, we have to do it, but only to necessarily like save the environment. But it's to say that like for anybody, yeah, I mean that's like
Well,
that's
I
one way
mean,
of putting it,
I
I
think
guess.
that it kind of goes back to the whole reason why we are, talking about this
Yeah.
is because, we wanted to write uh, a historical analysis on three different revolutionary movements, which included, anti-imperialism and communism hand in hand. Their how their movements and revolutions, discussed and maybe showed us some insight into the national question. I think that our historical, you know, an analyzation of China, South Africa, and Cuba, which have been our key areas of research for this specific area of writing that we want to write and present through Cadre Journal. Um, that's the whole reason why we're going through the history.
Yeah.
And we're going through different material contexts. Is because we can't have a definitive answer. We can't have a definitive uh, critique, I would say, because each condition will be different. But by looking back at history and looking at the success of Cuba, success of China, you know,
Failure of South
the
Africa.
failure of South Africa, I think getting rid of apartheid is
A
pretty
very
good,
huge
a good
success.
good success, and at least the Communist Party is part of the government.
Right.
As much as I would love for it to have a greater part, I still think that anti-imperialism in any scenario is a success, but it's a question again of how far you can take anti-imperialism to take down capitalism is and like we've talked about throughout it. But
Yeah.
I think that we have to continue to look at, of course, not only these three countries and not only countries where communism has been a critical part of anti-imperialism. We have to look at other scenarios. But if we want to understand the future, if we want to have a modern analysis of what's going on, we have to look at the kind of the contexts in the past that have,
Yeah.
in our view, I think have been
Yeah.
successful.
And I think we can kind of conclude and say actually that without anti-imperialism, communism is sort of meaningless. Like any communism in the future, really, this is to say that like any analysis of it in like any of its potentialities will have to be an anti-imperialist one. And that's to say that the hitherto analysis of communism that has lacked an anti-imperialist core and relies sort of on worker mobilization, particularly in the global north and in Europe, and constantly believes that Europe will be the place that communism begins. Like, even reading the Bolsheviks and like reading the early Soviets, like they believed Germany was the place where communism was going to start first in the world, not just because it's where Marx was from, but mainly because they believed capitalism was at its highest stage there. Similar with England, they believed that too. And to believe that England and Germany would become communist countries, like,
Hey,
I
never
think
never forget East Germany.
right. Well, yeah, I guess the DDR is a good example, but England, meanwhile, and similarly, the United States have shown very little potential for that, at
Mhm.
least in the communist form, to manifest.
Well, I think that the kind of the difficulties of the DDR kind of show that, it's
Yeah.
like, even if you can, I mean, part of it, I mean, that in itself is entirely,
Yeah.
maybe that's a can of worms to open, because
Right.
there's that East-West divide pre-war, where like already the eastern part was like the lesser developed part of it. But maybe that's too far. But even I would say,
Right.
even if you have a communist movement in the middle of, you know, the imperial beast, that's not necessarily a domino effect for the rest of the world.
Exactly. That's really the most important thing to say, is like, without necessarily liberating the rest of the world, or in a more
Liberation has to be collective,
right. Yeah. Or I would say, in fact, like, this view generally that European the European proletariat, or like Trotsky's view that they will liberate the colonies, like, they actually don't have a lot of incentive to do that in the present state of things if they're
Mhm.
benefiting from imperialism. So perhaps it's necessary to say, for the first thing, that this sort of uh, patronizing view about Europeans going and they have to go and liberate somebody else, like that first of all has to be kind of
Yeah.
dropped, and it has to be this insistence on people liberating themselves. But it's also to say that the kind of slack that a lot of communists have gotten throughout history, or like in the 20th century, of just being very Eurocentric and not really caring what happens anywhere else in the world, at a minimum that has to go, and there has to be more of a concerned, I think people generally don't have to limit their politics to any one thing. No one has to just be a third worldist, or just be a global northist, or whatever. Like, I guess, like, that would be if you're in like a more reformist kind of group. But really, the prospects for, there's legitimate action that can be done in the United States, but what has to be thought about is, like, who is it benefiting, and perhaps is there more of a revolutionary contribution that one can make to a movement elsewhere? That's kind of the critical thing to analyze, I guess. And
Yeah.
that has no good answer, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That's up for everybody to decide individually.
Yeah, for sure. Keep reading. I mean, I guess with that, do you want to like give a book recommendation, or
Well,
like a reading recommendation?
there are a lot of reading recommendations. I would recommend this one. The light is sort of dying a little bit, but it's Lenin's collected National Liberation, Socialism, and Imperialism. He talks about his different views on questions of national liberation, socialism, and imperialism, which is a great collection. And in particular, he has really fascinating writing about, like, national liberation as a key goal of communism, in his view of, what they were referring to at the time of, like, social democracy, anti-colonialism in particular being very critical to that, and the need to, allow the colonies to completely, win their independence, as like a necessary uh, privilege that every country is entitled to in the world. At the same time, he, has a very interesting analysis of nationalism as opposed to anti-colonialism, and he kind of contrasts the two and shows that anti-colonialism is more of a relevant charge. But this sets up really a lot of the analysis he will have in the national and colonial theses, which we wrote about in the article, and kind of sets the stage for what he's going to talk about with respect to the importance of, the proletariat that have liberated themselves also liberating the colonies, or not liberating them, but I guess, like, helping win their independence and whatever they can do, as like a very key goal of communism, because he sees that throughout Lenin's work, what he's really good at showing is how imperialism has allowed capitalism to maintain its hold over Europe, created this labor aristocracy. So he's very good for that. Yeah. Anything else?
I would say my reading suggestion is, I mean, like, shameless plug, but like,
Yeah.
you should read the article that
Yes.
we're writing.
Yeah.
In Cadre Journal. Like,
Or I guess
we want
this
to
will come out later.
Yeah,
after,
this one. I guess this will come out later.
So
if
it will
it's-
be read the article we have written.
Yes. Yes.
Have not currently written.
Yeah. And if with that, like, if you have your own writings, if you have your own ideas, feel free to email us. We have it on various social media platforms because we want to have a real journal, a real platform for people to discuss anti-imperialist and communist writings.
Yeah.
But like a real reading suggestion would be like any works by Mariátegui or The Red Corner by Mike Gonzalez, or yeah, just read some third world Marxist viewpoints.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.